When an economic crisis erupts, the narrative is always the same. Everyone is suffering, everyone is sacrificing, the pain is shared. This discourse sounds fair. But when you look at history, reality paints a far darker picture. Crises hit everyone, but not through the same door. For a salaried worker, a crisis means losing a job. For a small business owner, it means the cash flow drying up. For the middle class, it means savings evaporating, rent becoming unaffordable, the future growing uncertain. For the wealthy, however, a crisis is usually something quite different, a temporary dip in the portfolio, a loss on paper, an interim period, to be waited out with patience. This difference harbors one of the harshest truths in economic history. Income or assets. Everything lies in this distinction. Ordinary people live off their labor. And labor is extraordinarily fragile in times of crisis. A paycheck can vanish within weeks, working hours can be cut, contracts can be terminated. But a building, a stock portfolio, or a stake in a company endures as long as the owner is not forced to sell. This is precisely where two worlds diverge. If your life depends on labor income, a crisis feels like an existential threat. If it depends on assets, a crisis largely becomes a test of patience. According to OECD data, more than half of total wealth in member countries is held by the wealthiest 10%, and this share has continued to rise in many countries since 2010. Federal Reserve data collected in the aftermath of the 2008 Great Recession reveals the picture with striking clarity. By 2016, the wealthiest 10% had not merely recovered their prior wealth, they had surpassed their real average wealth from 2007. Lower and middle income groups, meanwhile, were still below pre-crisis levels. The collapse hits everyone. The recovery is selective. Forced selling, the most ruthless mechanism of crises. What truly deepens a crisis is that it forces people to take the wrong steps at exactly the wrong moment. Households without a financial buffer are compelled to liquidate their investments at depressed prices just to cover their bills. They become trapped in high-interest debt. They defer medical care, relocate, downsize, or find themselves accepting deeply unfavorable terms simply to get through the month. Wealthy households, by contrast, can stay outside this vicious cycle. They can hold their assets through the panic, refinance on better terms, and in some cases even step in as buyers while others are being pushed out of the market. It is true that crises do not automatically make anyone rich. But it is equally true that crises tend to strengthen the long-term position of those who hold liquidity. The chasm between the paper loss experienced by an asset owner and the lived reality of someone dependent on income is enormous. A billionaire may see a staggering erosion of wealth during a crisis, yet remain structurally immovable. A middle-class family that loses its job, its home equity cushion, and years of accumulated purchasing power may carry the echoes of that devastation for a decade. The scale of losses seems almost inversely proportional, but the weight of consequences is anything but. The system saves itself first. When governments and central banks spring into action during an economic crisis, their priorities are clear: preserve bank liquidity, keep credit channels open, suppress turbulence in bond markets, stabilize asset prices. Labor markets, real wages, and household balance sheets, however, typically fall to second place in this process, recovering far more slowly and far more unevenly. This is not a conspiracy. It is a reflection of the system's own internal logic. Nothing functions without preserving the flow mechanisms of capital. But the consequences of this logic are profoundly unjust. The system repairs the machinery of wealth before it restores the conditions of ordinary life. The data from the pandemic era lays this bare. Researchers at the World Inequality Database documented that by the end of 2021, wealth concentration had reached its highest level since the Second World War. The primary driver was the surge in asset prices produced by financial markets stabilized through policy support. The households holding the greatest volume of financial assets were the first and greatest beneficiaries of this growth. Those with limited savings or limited market exposure, meanwhile, experienced the crisis almost entirely through rising prices, job insecurity, and eroding purchasing power. Inflation, does it deliver the same pain to everyone? It is easy to reduce inflation to a single number. But that single number does not mean the same pain for everyone. Recent Federal Reserve research shows that adverse macroeconomic shocks generate higher inflationary pressure on low-income households. The reason is straightforward: low-income households spend a larger share of their budgets on essential goods. And during crises, food, rent, transportation, and energy prices are precisely the categories that rise most sharply. For a wealthy household, inflation is an inconvenience, alternatives can be found, the blow can be cushioned. For someone living off high dividend income or capital gains, elevated prices are dwarfed by the nominal appreciation of assets already swelling in value. But for a household that must allocate most of its income to necessities, inflation is a pay cut dressed up as a price tag. The crisis passes. The inequality remains. Crises are not momentary blows. They are mechanisms that reshape structure. OECD analysts examining post-Great Recession data found that wealth inequality increased in countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom. Financial assets recovered rapidly, but homeownership rates declined, and the gains the middle class managed to extract from housing wealth were far more modest. So even when everyone has been hurt by the collapse, the recovery does not embrace everyone equally. Those who hold the assets that policymakers and markets stabilize first move ahead faster. Those who leaned on labor, modest savings, or home values close their losses slowly, or not at all. Not everyone suffers less, but not everyone loses the same way. It would be wrong to say the wealthy emerge from crises unscathed. Markets fall, businesses collapse, balance sheets contract. But what the wealthy rarely lose is their position. Four pillars make this possible: the assets they own, the time they can afford to buy, the liquidity they can access, and the order in which the system gets repaired. Every major crisis in history has proven this, again and again. Through the credit panics of the 19th century, the Great Depressions of the 20th, and the financial collapses of the 21st, the structure has remained familiar. The names of the instruments changed. The shape of the institutions shifted. But the way wealth protects itself did not. Economic crises are not moments of shared sacrifice. They are sorting mechanisms that reveal whose risks were already protected all along. The storm soaks everyone. But some have already opened their umbrellas and are simply waiting it out.